Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really foundational, early childhood attachment.
That's right.
We've got a great set of sources from our listener covering attachment theory from, well, its origins right through to current thinking and interventions.
hmm
And our mission really is to distill how these very first bonds kind of forge the groundwork for who we become.
Absolutely. And, whether you're maybe preparing for interactions with kids or trying to understand your own relationship patterns, or maybe you're just curious about human connection,
Yeah.
this deep dive should offer some, I think, really valuable and maybe even surprising insights. It's fundamental stuff.
Okay, so let's jump right in then. When we talk about attachment, what are we defining here? It's not just a kid liking their mom or dad, is it?
No, not simply liking. The formal definition, the one used in the research, is about a lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. It's that really deep emotional tie, primarily forming between an infant and their main caregiver. And the key thing is, it goes way beyond just getting food or warmth.
Right, basic survival needs.
Exactly. Attachment theory really emphasizes this innate, almost primal need we have for safety and security within those close relationships.
So it's formed through kind of repeated interactions, especially when a child is upset or needs something.
Precisely. Those moments of distress are actually critical learning opportunities for the infant about the caregiver's reliability. And the impact of this early bond, well, it's huge.
Huge help.
The sources are really clear on this. The quality of that initial attachment profoundly influences, well, almost everything. Emotional regulation, social skills, even cognitive abilities and physical health down the road. It's like a foundational blueprint.
Okay, blueprint. And the term secure base that pops up a lot, what's the essence of that?
Yeah, the secure base is a really core concept. Think of it as an internalized feeling of safety and trust.
Internalized.
Okay. It develops when a child experiences caregiving that's consistent and responsive. Knowing the caregiver is a reliable source of support gives the child the confidence to, well, go out and explore the world.
Ah, so it allows them to explore because they feel safe.
Exactly. It lets them learn, grow, tackle challenges, and bounce back better when things get tough. It's really the bedrock of resilience.
Got it. So who are the main architects of this whole theory? Bowlby and Ainsworth seem key from the sources.
They are absolutely the foundational figures. John Bowlby, he was the initial visionary. He actually trained in psychoanalysis.
Oh, interesting.
But he became pretty dissatisfied with the theories floating around then. Things like cupboard love, the idea that babies only love their mothers because they feed them.
Right. Sounds a bit simplistic.
Bowlby thought so too. He felt it completely missed the crucial emotional needs and the real impact of actual life events, like being separated from a caregiver.
So he was focused on the environment, what was actually happening to children?
Exactly. He wasn't just focused on internal drives. He drew inspiration from others too, like Ian Suddy, who talked about a primary need for affection, and even William Blatz, who was Mary Ainsworth's mentor.
Blatz.
Yeah, Blatz emphasized security as a lifelong need and actually first introduced that secure base idea. Bowlby also made really important observations himself.
Like what?
He studied young offenders he called affectionless characters, and he saw the intense distress of children in hospitals, separated from their families. Those real-world observations were critical.
It sounds like he was pulling ideas from all over the place.
He really was. That's what made his approach so powerful. He integrated ideas from ethology, Lorenz and the imprinting ducks,
Yeah.
evolutionary biology, thinking about survival value, control systems theory about maintaining proximity, and even cognitive psychology with the idea of internal working models.
Internal working models. We'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Definitely. His main argument was that attachment is an innate instinctual system designed to keep us safe, with the caregiver acting as that secure base and also a safe haven to return to.
Right.
His 1951 report for the WHO was really influential, arguing for that continuous relationship. Then the formal theory started taking shape in papers around 1958, which was also when Harlow's monkey studies came out, showing the importance of contact comfort over just food.
Ah, the wire mother versus cloth mother experiment.
Exactly. And Bowlby's big work is his Attachment and Loss trilogy. So he laid the theoretical groundwork.
Okay, so Bowlby sets the stage, and then Ainsworth. she brought the empirical evidence. How did she do that?
Precisely. Mary Ainsworth was the empirical pioneer. She started with these incredibly detailed naturalistic observations of mothers and infants, first in Uganda.
Uganda, why there?
It provided a different cultural context to observe these interactions. And through that work, she really highlighted the vital role of maternal sensitivity,
Sensitivity meaning?
meaning the caregiver's ability to accurately notice the infant's signals, interpret them correctly, and respond appropriately and promptly. But her most famous contribution, the one everyone knows, is the strange situation.
Right, the strange situation. That sounds like a key method. What actually happens in it?
It's a standardized lab procedure. It's designed to observe how babies, usually around 9 to 13 months old, balance their need for closeness with their drive to explore when they experience a little bit of stress.
So you put them in an unfamiliar room.
Yes, an unfamiliar playroom, and then they go through a sequence of 8 short episodes. These involve the caregiver, the baby, and a stranger entering, leaving, and reuniting in a planned way.
The idea is to sort of gently activate the attachment system in a controlled way.
Exactly. You create mild, ecologically relevant stressors, the unfamiliar room, the stranger, the separations. And by watching the infant's behavior,
Work behind the behaviors.
things like how much do they explore when mom or dad is there, how upset do they get when the caregiver leaves, how do they react to the stranger, and crucially, what do they do when the caregiver comes back?
The reunion.
The reunion behavior is key.
Yeah.
Based on these observations, Ainsworth originally identified 3 main patterns: secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure ambivalent or resistant.
Okay, 3 main types initially.
Yes. And later, Mary Main and Judith Solomon identified a 4th category, which is disorganized or disoriented attachment. Ainsworth also really elaborated on that secure base concept, showing how caregiver sensitivity directly builds it.
Okay, so these patterns, these are the attachment styles we hear about. Can we break those down? What does each one look like?
Absolutely. These 4 styles are essentially organized patterns of emotional and behavioral responses in these close relationships. Let's start with secure attachment, often labeled type B. It's generally seen as the most adaptive outcome.
Secure. What are the signs? How does a securely attached child behave?
Well, they confidently use their caregiver as that secure base we talked about. They feel safe enough to explore the room and play. They might get upset when the caregiver leaves.
That seems normal.
It is. But the key is the reunion. They greet the caregiver positively, maybe seek some comfort, and they're readily soothed. They clearly prefer their caregiver to the stranger and go to them if they're distressed.
And what's the caregiving like for these kids?
Typically, their caregivers are consistently sensitive and responsive. They're attuned to the child's signals, they respond promptly and appropriately, they're warm, emotionally available, and interactions are often enjoyable for both. They provide safety, comfort, validation, and support for exploration.
So the child learns, I can trust my needs will be met.
Exactly. That builds what Bowlby called an internal working model. For secure kids, it's a positive model of themselves as worthy of care and of others as generally reliable and trustworthy. That secure base is like an emotional anchor, freeing them up.
Makes sense. Okay, what about insecure avoidant? Type A, I think.
Yes, type A. These children tend to, well, avoid or ignore the caregiver, especially during those reunion moments after a separation.
They just act like nothing happened.
Pretty much. They don't show much obvious emotion, whether the caregiver leaves or returns. They might not seek closeness or comfort. Interestingly, though, sometimes if you measure their heart rate or stress hormones,
Physiologically, they might still be stressed.
exactly, there can be underlying distress even if it's not obvious outwardly. The caregiving associated with this style is often consistently unresponsive or unavailable, maybe even rejecting when the child does seek comfort.
So the child learns not to bother.
Essentially, yes. Or they learn to suppress their attachment needs. Their internal working model often involves a sort of defensively positive view of themselves like, I'm independent, I don't need anyone,
Yeah.
but a negative view of others as unreliable or rejecting. Expressing needs is seen as futile.
Okay. Then the third type Ainsworth found. Insecure, ambivalent, or resistant. Type C, sometimes called anxious.
That's right, type C, often also referred to as anxious ambivalent or anxious resistant. These children are often quite wary or clingy even before separation. They might not explore much.
They stick close.
Yeah, and they tend to get very distressed when the caregiver leaves.
Yeah.
But the really distinctive part is the reunion.
What happens then?
They show ambivalence. They might seek contact, wanting to be picked up, but then resist comfort once they get it squirming, arching away, maybe hitting. They're hard to soothe.
So wanting closeness but also pushing it away sounds confusing for the child.
It is. They can seem preoccupied with the caregiver's availability, yet angry or passive when the caregiver tries to comfort them. The caregiving pattern here is often inconsistent.
Inconsistent how?
Sometimes the caregiver is attuned and responsive. Other times they might be neglectful or intrusive or misinterpret the child's cues. So the child never really knows what to expect.
Unpredictable.
Exactly. This unpredictability seems to foster an internal working model where the child feels uncertain about their own worthiness, but they keep a strong, often anxious focus on the caregiver, maybe believing they have to be really demanding or vigilant to get their needs met.
Okay, and the last one, the one identified later. Disorganized, disoriented. Type D.
Yes, type D. This one is considered the most problematic. These children lack any consistent strategy for dealing with the stress of the strange situation. Their behavior is often contradictory, conflicted, sometimes bizarre or disoriented.
Like what kind of behaviors?
You might see them freeze suddenly, or show dazed expressions, repetitive movements, or even signs of fear towards the caregiver. They might approach the caregiver for comfort, but then abruptly turn away or collapse.
Fear of the caregiver. That sounds really difficult.
It is. This pattern is most often linked to situations where the caregiver is simultaneously a source of comfort and a source of fear.
How does that happen?
It can be associated with unresolved trauma or loss in the caregiver's own history, parental mental illness, substance abuse, or maltreatment of the child. The caregiver might behave in frightening ways or seem frightened themselves.
So the child is caught in an impossible situation.
Exactly. Their biological drive is to seek comfort from the caregiver when scared, but the caregiver is the source of the fear. The internal working model here is often deeply negative, viewing self, others, and the world as unsafe. Relationships are seen as inherently dangerous or confusing.
Wow. Yeah.
It's really important, though, to remember that even the insecure styles avoidant, ambivalent, are generally seen as adaptive strategies developed by the child in response to their specific caregiving environment. They're trying to cope as best they can.
Right, it's not the child's fault.
Not at all. And crucially, these styles aren't necessarily fixed for life. We mentioned earned security earlier. People can move towards a more secure way of relating later on through positive relationships or therapy. It's not deterministic. That's good to hear. You mentioned the strange situation procedure again. Can we just quickly run through the steps? What makes it such a cornerstone?
Sure. So, as we said, the goal is to see how the child balances attachment needs and exploration under mild stress. It's usually for infants, say, 9 to 18 months old.
In that unfamiliar playroom.
Right. It starts with caregiver and infant alone chance to explore. Then a stranger enters, talks to the caregiver, then tries to interact with the infant.
Okay.
Then, episode 3, the caregiver leaves quietly. First separation infant is alone with the stranger.
Stressful for the baby, presumably.
Can be. Episode 4 is the first reunion. Caregiver returns, greets the infant, offers comfort if needed, and the stranger leaves. Then, episode 5, the caregiver leaves again, second separation. Infant is alone.
Okay, another separation.
Then, episode 6, the stranger enters instead of the caregiver, tries to interact or comfort.
How does the baby react to that?
That's one of the things observed. Finally, episode 8, the caregiver returns, second reunion, and the stranger leaves. And throughout this, researchers are watching what specifically?
They're coding specific behaviors. How much does the child explore when the caregiver is there? Secure base use. How much distress do they show when separated? Separation anxiety. How do they react to the stranger anxiety? And, as we stressed, how do they behave when the caregiver returns? Reunion behavior.
That reunion behavior seems really critical.
It's often considered the most diagnostic element. Does the child seek proximity? Do they accept comfort? Are they easily soothed? Do they ignore or avoid? Are they resistant or angry? Based on the overall pattern across the episodes, particularly the reunions, the infant is classified into one of those attachment categories.
And its value. Why is it so important?
Its main value lies in providing a standardized, replicable way to empirically study attachment. It turned Bowlby's ideas into something testable.
Right, moving from theory to data.
Exactly. It generated a huge amount of research, refined the theory, and deeply influenced our understanding of early development, parenting, and interventions. And while it is a lab procedure, the stressors are designed to mimic everyday occurrences, meeting someone new, mom leaving the room briefly.
So it has some real-world relevance.
Yes, and again, that reunion behavior is thought to really reflect the child's learned expectations, their internal working model of how their caregiver typically responds when they are distressed.
Okay, so If these early bonds are this foundational, this important, what's the ripple effect? How does attachment quality actually impact development as a child grows?
The impact is really broad, like ripples spreading outwards.
Mhm.
Secure attachment, acting as that secure base, essentially paves the way for healthier development across multiple areas. It fosters exploration, learning, and resilience.
Let's maybe break that down. How does it affect, say, emotional development?
Secure kids generally develop better emotional regulation skills. They learn how to manage their feelings more effectively. They also tend to show greater empathy for others and develop a more positive, coherent sense of self.
And insecure kids.
They might face more challenges. Depending on the style, difficulties with regulating emotions could manifest as being overly sensitive and easily overwhelmed, like often seen in anxious attachment, or maybe suppressing emotions as an avoidant, or really struggling to manage intense or confusing feelings, especially with disorganized attachment. Expressing emotions safely can be harder.
What about socially? How they get along with others?
Secure attachment is strongly linked to greater social competence. These children tend to form more positive, trusting relationships with peers. They often show less disruptive or aggressive behavior, are better at handling conflicts, and are generally more empathetic and cooperative.
Makes sense. And the insecure styles.
They can lead to difficulties forming close friendships, maybe issues with trust or intimacy. Avoidant individuals might shy away from closeness, while anxious individuals might be overly clingy or dependent. Disorganized attachment often brings significant challenges with trust and navigating social cues, potentially leading to more withdrawn or aggressive behaviors.
Fascinating. Does it connect to cognitive development too, learning and thinking?
It does seem to. Because securely attached children feel safe to explore, they tend to engage more actively with their environment, participate in more complex play, and develop better problem-solving skills. This creates a positive feedback loop for cognitive growth.
And insecure attachment can hinder that.
It can. Avoidant children might explore, but perhaps less deeply or without referencing the caregiver. Anxious or disorganized children might have their attention and cognitive resources tied up with worry about the caregiver's availability or dealing with fear, potentially compromising their focus on learning.
It's really striking how interconnected it all is. What about physical health? Is there a link there?
There is growing evidence suggesting a link. Secure attachment seems associated with better stress regulation, biologically lower levels of chronic stress hormones like cortisol. This can positively impact the immune system and support overall healthy physical development.
And the flip side.
The chronic stress that can be associated with insecure attachment, especially disorganized, might have negative physiological consequences over time. In extreme cases of early deprivation or problematic attachment, it's even been linked to things like failure to thrive in infancy.
Wow. And maybe the most significant link, mental health, risk and resilience.
Absolutely. Secure attachment is considered a major protective factor. It reduces the likelihood of developing things like anxiety disorders, depression, and significant behavioral problems later on.
And insecurity increases risk.
Yes, significantly. Insecure attachment in general is a well-established risk factor for a range of mental health difficulties. Anxious attachment is linked to higher rates of anxiety disorders, including separation anxiety. Avoidant attachment can be linked to internalizing problems like withdrawal or depression. Disorganized attachment carries the highest risk associated with anxiety, depression, PTSD symptoms, externalizing problems like aggression, and it's considered a significant risk factor for more severe psychopathology later in life, including personality disorders.
So it really sets a trajectory.
It creates a vulnerability, doesn't guarantee problems, but it increases the odds.
Yeah.
That caregiver secure base really supports the intertwined development of emotional, social, and cognitive skills. When that base is insecure, it can create a cascade of difficulties, where challenges in one area can exacerbate problems in others, amplifying risk over time.
So these patterns laid down early really do cast a long shadow then. Does that mean we're basically stuck with the attachment style we developed as babies?
That's a really important question. There is a tendency towards continuity, yes. Those internal working models we keep mentioning, they tend to persist and shape how we approach new relationships. We often recreate patterns.
So history repeats itself.
To some extent it can, but this is crucial. It's not deterministic. The sources strongly emphasize that change is possible. There's malleability.
How does that change happen?
Through new experiences. Particularly significant, positive, and stable relationships later in life with partners, friends, mentors, or through therapy can actually help reshape those internal working models. This leads to what's called earned security.
Earned security. I like that term.
It signifies that someone might have had difficult early experiences leading to an insecure style, but through later positive experiences or conscious effort, they've developed a more secure way of relating.
How do these patterns typically play out during, say, adolescence? That's a time of big relationship shifts.
Absolutely. Early attachment continues to influence peer relationships significantly. Secure teens generally find it easier to form close friendships, seek and provide support appropriately, navigate conflicts more effectively, and experience intimacy in healthy ways.
And insecure teens.
They might struggle more. Depending on their style, they could have difficulty forming truly intimate bonds, experience more conflict, or manage conflict less effectively. You might see more negative emotions like hostility or withdrawal in their social interactions.
Does it affect how they cope generally?
Yes, secure attachment tends to foster better social and communication skills and more adaptive coping strategies for dealing with stress. Insecure attachment, both anxious and avoidant, can be linked to ongoing anxiety, perhaps fewer effective coping mechanisms, and research does show a link between insecure attachment in adolescence and increased risk for depressive symptoms.
Okay, and then fast forward to adulthood. How does our attachment history shape our romantic relationships, our friendships, our overall mental well-being?
The impact is really profound, especially in intimate relationships. Securely attached adults tend to build trusting, lasting connections. They generally have good self-esteem, feel comfortable with both intimacy and autonomy.
Not too clingy, not too distant.
Exactly. They can seek support when they need it, share feelings openly, and tend to report higher relationship satisfaction and overall well-being.
What about the insecure styles in adulthood? Let's start with anxious, or preoccupied as it's sometimes called.
Adults with an anxious or preoccupied style often crave intimacy and closeness, but they simultaneously worry a lot about their partner's availability, about being abandoned, or whether their feelings are truly reciprocated.
Sounds stressful.
It can be. This can lead to relationship patterns characterized by high emotional intensity, frequent need for reassurance, maybe jealousy or clinginess. They might experience more relationship breakups, and they are at higher risk for anxiety and depression.
And the avoidant style, sometimes called dismissive.
Avoidant or dismissive adults often find intimacy uncomfortable. They tend to value independence very highly, sometimes to the point of suppressing their own needs for connection. They might invest less emotionally in relationships, seem distant, or struggle with deep emotional conversations.
The lone wolf type, maybe.
Sometimes, yeah. They might prefer solitude and downplay the importance of close relationships. This pattern is also linked to increased risk for certain physical and mental health problems, possibly due to suppressed emotions or lack of social support.
And the disorganized style, often termed fearful avoidant in adults.
This is arguably the most challenging pattern in adulthood, too. Individuals with a fearful, avoidant, or disorganized style often have a conflicting desire for closeness alongside a deep-seated fear of intimacy and a lack of trust.
Wanting connection but being afraid of it.
Exactly. They might seek closeness, but then push people away when they feel too vulnerable. Relationships can be tumultuous, marked by ambivalence and instability. This style is associated with the poorest relationship and health outcomes, including higher risks for severe mental health issues.
You mentioned mental health risks across the board for insecure styles.
Yes, insecure attachment in adulthood is consistently identified as a significant risk factor for a wide array of mental health problems: depression, various anxiety disorders, PTSD, eating disorders, substance abuse, even suicidal ideation and personality disorders.
Specific links to personality disorders.
Yes, attachment anxiety, that preoccupation with relationships, is often linked to the emotional dysregulation components seen in disorders like borderline personality disorder, BPD. Attachment avoidance, that discomfort with closeness, is linked more to the inhibitedness or detachment component of personality problems. And there's a particularly strong association noted between insecure attachment, especially the preoccupied and disorganized patterns, and BPD itself.
So those early internal working models, they really can shape our adult lives profoundly.
They can create self-fulfilling prophecies. If you expect rejection, you might behave in ways that inadvertently push partners away. And beyond relationships, insecure attachment can unfortunately contribute to life paths with more stress and adversity impacting things like parenting styles, anger management, housing stability, job security, even involvement in substance abuse or criminality. It has incredibly far-reaching consequences.
It really underscores the importance of that early caregiving environment. Let's circle back to that. What are the absolute key factors in caregiving that shape attachment security?
The absolute cornerstone, as highlighted consistently in the sources, is caregiver sensitivity and responsiveness.
We defined that earlier, but just to recap.
It's the caregiver's ability to accurately perceive the infant's signals, interpret them correctly, and then respond promptly and appropriately to meet the child's needs, both physical and emotional.
Perception, interpretation, response.
Yes, and key elements underpinning this are warmth, consistency in responding, and general emotional availability. This kind of caregiving is really the primary determinant of secure attachment because it builds that fundamental trust.
The sources also mention attuned parenting. How is that different?
Attunement is a deeper level of sensitivity. It implies a kind of emotional synchrony, a two-way process where the caregiver is not just responding to needs, but also reflecting the child's emotional state, giving it meaning, helping the child understand and eventually regulate their own feelings. It's about being in tune.
What can get in the way of that attunement?
Many things, unfortunately. Parental mental health issues like depression or anxiety, substance abuse problems, high levels of external stress like poverty or relationship conflict, even just sheer exhaustion can interfere with a parent's capacity to be consistently attuned.
But specific behaviors do help foster security.
Absolutely. Things like being consistent in responding to distress, responding promptly rather than leaving a child to cry it out indefinitely, offering comforting physical touch, engaging in enjoyable reciprocal interaction and play, and just generally being emotionally present and available. And the good news is, these are skills.
Skills that can be learned.
Yes, definitely. Caregiving skills are modifiable, which is why interventions can be effective.
Okay, caregiver sensitivity is key. What about the child's own innate temperament? Does a difficult baby automatically become insecurely attached?
Temperament certainly plays a role in the dynamic. Temperament is that inborn style of responding activity level, intensity, adaptability, mood, etc. Some babies are just naturally more easygoing, others more intense or sensitive.
Right.
The concept of goodness of fit is relevant here.
Mm.
How well does the child's temperament match the caregiver's style and the environment's demands?
So a mismatch could cause problems.
It can create challenges. A highly sensitive baby with a caregiver who is perhaps less patient or perceptive might struggle more. A very active child with parents who prefer quiet might experience more friction. A challenging temperament can sometimes elicit less positive responses from caregivers if they don't adapt.
But is temperament the deciding factor?
No. The research consistently shows that caregiver sensitivity is a stronger predictor of attachment security than infant temperament alone.
So good parenting can override a difficult temperament.
It often can, yes. A sensitive, responsive caregiver can learn to adapt their style to meet the needs of a child with a more challenging temperament and still foster a secure attachment. Parenting is always bidirectional, a dance between caregiver and child, but the quality of the caregiver's engagement and responsiveness seems to hold more weight in determining the attachment outcome.
Okay, sensitive caregiving is primary. Now, what about really negative early experiences? Trauma, abuse, neglect? How do ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, fit into this?
ACEs, which include things like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, neglect, or witnessing serious household dysfunction like domestic violence or substance abuse. They can have a devastating impact on attachment.
How so?
They fundamentally undermine the conditions needed for secure attachment. They shatter the child's sense of safety, predictability, and trust in the caregiver, especially if the caregiver is the source of the adversity.
So trauma involving the caregiver is particularly damaging to the attachment system.
Extremely damaging. It's very strongly linked to insecure attachment, particularly the disorganized pattern we discussed earlier. The child is trapped in that paradox of needing comfort from the very person who is frightening or harming them.
Right, that fear-comfort conflict.
Exactly. ACEs violate the core requirements for security. And we know from extensive research that ACEs are linked to a huge range of negative outcomes later in life, both physical and mental health problems. Attachment disruption often acts as a key mediator in that pathway from early adversity to later difficulties.
It's a bleak picture, but understanding it is crucial. Given this knowledge, it's heartening that interventions exist. What do we know about their effectiveness? Can we actually help families build more secure connections?
Yes, definitely. There's a solid and growing evidence base showing that attachment-based interventions can be effective. Meta-analyses often show significant positive effects, increasing rates of secure attachment and, very importantly, reducing rates of disorganized attachment in high-risk groups.
That's really encouraging. Can you give us some examples of specific programs mentioned in the sources?
Sure, one well-researched example is Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-up, or ABC.
ABC, who is that for?
It's typically targeted towards caregivers of infants and toddlers considered at high risk. Maybe there's a history of maltreatment, or the children are in foster care, kinship care, or recently adopted.
And what does it involve?
It's usually brief, maybe 10 weekly home visits. The focus is very practical, helping caregivers provide nurturing care, engage in mutually responsive interactions, and, crucially, learn to provide care without frightening behaviors. They use techniques like in the moment, coaching during interactions, and reviewing video clips together.
And the results?
Generally very positive. Studies show higher rates of secure attachment and lower rates of disorganized attachment in children who participate compared to control groups. They also see improvements in the child's self-regulation, normalization of stress hormone patterns, and caregivers show increased sensitivity, more positive affect, and less intrusive behavior. Some cognitive benefits for the children have also been noted.
Okay, that sounds promising. What's another one? Circle of security.
Yes, Circle of Security Parenting, or COSP. This is designed for a broader audience of parents and caregivers.
So not just high risk.
Correct. It can be used more preventatively as well. It's typically delivered over 6 to 8 sessions, often in a group format, but sometimes individually. A key feature is using video examples, sometimes including clips from the strange situation, to help parents understand their child's needs using the Circle of Security visual model.
The circle? What does that illustrate?
It helps parents see the child's natural cycle of needing to go out and explore, supported by the secure base, and needing to come back in for comfort and connection, met by the safe haven. The goal is to enhance the parent's ability to observe their child's cues, reflect on the meaning behind the behavior, and respond sensitively to those underlying needs.
And is it effective?
The evidence is a bit more mixed in terms of directly demonstrating increases in secure attachment rates compared to ABC. However, it does show promise in reducing unsupportive parental responses to distress, and parents often report feeling less stressed and more confident and skilled in their parenting. Its effectiveness might also depend partly on the parent's own attachment history.
Interesting. What about parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT? That sounds more focused on behavior problems.
It is often used for young children, say 2 to 7 years old, who have significant externalizing behavior problems like defiance or aggression. But it has strong attachment principles built in.
How does it work?
It involves a therapist coaching the parent live through an earpiece while they interact with their child in a playroom. It has 2 phases. First is child-directed interaction, or CDI, which focuses entirely on strengthening the relationship, teaching parents skills to show warmth, enthusiasm, and positive attention, basically rebuilding positive connection.
So relationship first.
Exactly. Then comes parent-directed interaction, or PDI, where parents learn specific behavior management techniques like giving clear, effective commands and using consistent, predictable consequences.
And the outcomes for PCIT?
Very strong evidence base. It's highly effective at reducing child behavior problems and improving parenting skills. But importantly, it also leads to increases in the child's feelings of security and attachment towards the parent, and parents report less stress and more confidence.
So it addresses behavior by strengthening the relationship.
That's a key mechanism. Lastly, there's mentalization-based treatment, or MBT, which can be adapted for parents, children, adolescents, and families.
Mentalization. That's about understanding mental states.
Precisely. It's the capacity to understand our own and others' behavior in terms of underlying thoughts, feelings, intentions, beliefs, and desires. When mentalizing breaks down, especially under stress, misunderstandings and conflicts escalate.
So MBT helps people mentalize better.
Yes. It aims to enhance this capacity in families where difficulties in mentalizing are contributing to problems. The therapist helps parents and children understand these links, interrupt cycles where mentalizing fails, and regain the ability to think about mental states even when emotions run high. The therapist models a mentalizing stance, being curious, open, and non-judgmental about underlying states.
What kind of results do you see with MBT?
Improvements in emotional regulation, reductions in problematic behaviors, families report more satisfying and secure interactions, individuals develop a more coherent sense of self, and generally a greater ability to make sense of confusing or difficult behavior in themselves and others.
So across these different interventions, what seem to be the common threads, the active ingredients?
Many effective interventions share a focus on the caregiver-child relationship itself, the dyad. They often work to enhance the caregiver's skills, both their observable behaviors and their internal reflective capacity, their ability to understand the child's perspective. Key ingredients frequently involve increasing caregiver attunement and sensitivity, and reducing behaviors that might be frightening or overwhelming for the child.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, like any major theory, attachment theory hasn't been without its critics or ongoing refinements, right? What are some of the important critical reflections or evolving understandings?
Absolutely, it's a dynamic field. One major area of ongoing discussion is around cultural variations and the whole universality question.
Right. You mentioned Bowlby assumed it was universal, with secure being the norm everywhere.
He did, based on evolutionary logic.
Mm.
But cross-cultural research, like the big meta-analysis by Van Eisendorn and Kroonenberg, painted a more nuanced picture.
What did they find?
They found that secure attachment was the most common pattern across many different cultures studied. However, there were significant variations in the proportions of the different insecure styles.
Like how?
For example, they found higher rates of insecure avoidant attachment in some Western European countries, like Germany, and higher rates of insecure resistant attachment in places like Japan and Israel compared to the U.S. samples Ainsworth initially studied. Interestingly, they often found more variation within a single country than between different countries.
So, culture clearly plays a role. Did this lead to critiques of the strange situation itself?
Yes, critics argued that the strange situation procedure might be an imposed etic, meaning it applies a Western-centric framework and assumes certain behaviors have the same meaning everywhere, which might not be true.
Can you give an example?
Well, the higher rates of resistant behavior, sometimes seen in Japanese infants, might reflect their relative lack of experience with separations from the mother, given common co-sleeping and caring practices, rather than the same kind of underlying insecurity or inconsistent caregiving seen in Western samples. Similarly, how infants react to strangers can be heavily influenced by cultural norms around stranger danger, and the emphasis on exploration as a key sign of security might reflect Western values around independence more than universal ones.
So, we need to be careful about interpreting behaviors outside their cultural context.
Exactly. There's been a call for more emic approaches, studies designed from within a specific culture, to understand attachment dynamics in ways that are meaningful within that context. The need for secure bonds might be universal, but how security is expressed and fostered can vary.
What about the role of fathers? Bowlby seemed quite focused on the mother.
That's another key area of evolution. Bowlby's initial emphasis on the mother, sometimes interpreted as monotropy, one primary attachment figure, has been critiqued and refined.
So, babies can attach securely to dads, too.
Absolutely. Contemporary understanding is that infants can, and often do, form secure attachments to any caregiver who provides consistent, sensitive, and responsive care. Multiple attachments are the norm, not the exception, although they might be organized hierarchically with maybe one primary figure.
And fathers' roles.
Research clearly shows fathers play a crucial role. While father-infant interaction styles might sometimes differ on average, maybe involving more physical, stimulating play, these interactions are highly valuable for development. Secure attachments to fathers, mothers, grandparents, or other regular caregivers all predict positive outcomes. This is really important for understanding diverse family structures and the role of childcare today.
Good point. Any other major critiques or ways the theory has evolved?
Well, early on, there were concerns about the theory being too deterministic, suggesting early experiences rigidly dictate later life.
That fixed for life idea.
Exactly. The modern view, as we've discussed, emphasizes malleability and the potential for change through later experiences in therapy, that concept of earned security. There have also been ongoing methodological debates about the strange situation, its artificiality, brevity, the potential for subjective interpretation, its cross-cultural validity. And related to the father discussion, there's been a needed correction of the historical tendency, both in research and popular culture, to place the primary burden or focus solely on mothers without always considering the father's role or the broader societal context and support systems needed for all caregivers.
And integration with other fields.
Yes, that's a huge area of growth. There's immense interest in the neurobiology of attachment, how early experiences shape brain development, stress regulation systems, motion processing circuits, and the integration with mentalization theory, understanding how attachment relationships foster the ability to understand minds, has been incredibly fruitful. So the field is definitely moving towards more complex, systemic, and context-aware models.
This has been just incredibly rich and detailed. Thank you. To try and synthesize all of this, what would you say are the absolute core core takeaways for listeners from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaways are, first, that our earliest relational experiences truly are profoundly important and intricately linked to our well-being across the entire lifespan. This is fundamental.
Okay.
Second, attachment itself is a basic human need. Secure attachment provides a vast array of developmental benefits, acting as a buffer and promoting resilience.
And insecurity.
Insecure attachment, while often an understandable adaptation, unfortunately carries significant risks for later difficulties. Third, caregiver sensitivity and responsiveness are absolutely crucial ingredients in fostering security.
The crucially.
Crucially, change is possible. Attachment patterns aren't rigidly fixed, and interventions can make a real difference in helping families build stronger, more secure connections. And understanding all this has massive implications for parenting, for education, for therapy, even for public policy supporting families.
Looking ahead, where do you see research focusing in the future? What are the big unanswered questions?
Oh, there's still so much to explore. Definitely continuing to understand cultural nuances more deeply, digging further into the neurobiology, the brain mechanisms involved. More long-term longitudinal studies tracking people from infancy well into adulthood, refining and comparing different intervention approaches to see what works best for home, and also understanding attachment in modern context, thinking about technology, diverse family forms, global mobility, how all that impacts these fundamental processes.
Fascinating. And maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder after this deep dive. As you reflect on everything we've discussed about early attachment, consider that really powerful interplay between our innate biological drive for connection and the specific shaping influence of our individual caregiving experiences. What does that mean for how you understand yourself, perhaps your own patterns, and the people in your life? And thinking bigger, how can we all in our families, communities, and society work towards fostering more secure, supportive connections, knowing just how deeply these foundational bonds impact us throughout our lives?
A really important question to sit with.
Indeed. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive.